Hey everyone, I wanted to welcome you for joining us today. I am actually joined by one of my current students, Chris Mercaldo, and I want to talk about him a little briefly. And one of the goals of our conversation is to talk a bit about our Masters of Science and Finance program, which Chris is a member of, which is awesome, and it's been a great year for him. But also to use this as a launch point of conversation about Netflix. And we'll get into that a little bit second half of this conversation, but we're kind of confident you're familiar with Netflix and a lot of fascinating news about them. I want to talk a little bit, give some insights on that. But before we get into Netflix and that conversation, I wanted to kind of talk about Chris for a bit. Chris is one of our MSF students. He has probably a little bit different of a background in some ways. He comes from actually having an MBA before coming in the MSF program. A lot of really fascinating work experience that we've talked about. And I think just a great example of a student who's been really successful here, who's done really well, and has, I'll be honest, I'll be forthright, and I'm biased, I guess, in some ways. Chris and I both went to Villanova University for our undergrads, which is a fun thing that he shared at the beginning, but more importantly, I think it's just been a pleasure to teach Chris. So my thought is, hey, there was really nothing better than to have this conversation and bring him in on it. So Chris, welcome. I want you to give a little bit about your background, and then we'll kind of kick this conversation off.
Yeah, the MSF has been amazing. Dr. Butler, when he was interviewing me for getting into the program, he was like, "You already have an MBA." He's like, "What? Do you really think this is going to add incremental value to that?" And I said yes, and I kind of talked him into it, and it's been incredible. Just, my base background was marketing at Villanova. Great education. I did an MBA, once again, concentrated in marketing. At the time, I was working for Disney, doing ride design and analyzing what brands and franchises we should make more attractions of in the parks. But what I saw over time was finance was really the piece that was driving everything. All these final decisions on every project I worked on, it was the finance person who was really making that final call, even overriding some design decisions or whatever. So I was like, oh man, when the pandemic hit, I did a little self-analysis and was like, okay, in 10 years, what would I need to get to where I want to go? Yeah. And I felt like I was weakest on the finance side. Yeah. So I actually called my finance professor at Rollins College. And I told him, first thing out of his mouth was like, you'd probably be okay not needing it. But once I walked him through my logic, he was like, if you want to increase your arsenal, so you know the terms better and you know the content better, all I can say is it's been one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, though. It's been great.
Good. So I'm going to use that. I don't want to introduce myself, but I'm Patrick Badolato, and interestingly, I have taught in our Master of Science and Finance program, MSF program we call it, for last many years. But full disclosure, I'm an accounting professor, and I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation, which is, as an accounting professor teaching accounting classes, I wanted to kind of offer that's always been a fascinating thing to teach both MBAs and MSF students here at the McCombs School of Business, because one of the things we try to do, and Chris, I'm really going to want your insights on this, boots on the ground, you've done it, is to make sure that, which I think is just so critical to the way that we approach accounting, is it's not the stereotypical debits and credits and bookkeeping stuff that people who have a little bit of exposure, they took one class in high school, kind of wave it off at. But you were talking about the need to improve your skills in finance. And one of the things we've mentioned is just that how accounting is the language of most of that decision making. It gives you that arsenal, right? It equips you with that stuff. And so we'll get into this a little bit. It's kind of why we're doing this conversation on Netflix. But what is the role of accounting? Well, our particular class, there's a financial statement analysis and advanced financial statement analysis, but both of them are deep dives into making sure that we first and foremost understand the companies, understand the business. So we try not to just get seduced by a few summary metrics. We really want to get into how do we understand the business itself and use that as a launch point to think about things like forecasting or valuation. And the goal is, and again, Chris, I'm really going to want your insights here, but the goal is that our students really in any program can walk out and think about, how do I understand the business? How do I understand their financial information? How do I use qualitative and quantitative and marry that stuff together in order to be better equipped at those sort of stereotypical applications, which is, that's definitely what finance is doing, but it's that accounting is such an important piece of that. So Chris, you've sat through 3 of my classes.
They're great, all 3.
You made it, right?
Yeah.
Congratulations. And that last one's kind of elective, which is a fun one. We just finished up today with some awesome student presentations. But what thoughts do you have? What can you offer? I guess, because I know that I'm biased, of course, but
I'm going to backtrack
a different perspective.
I'm going to backtrack the start of your question, because accounting at Villanova, there's no knock on it. Accounting at Rollins College in the MBA program, it was putting things into boxes. It was just, this is a debit, this is a credit, this is how you sort this stuff, this is what a balance sheet looks like. With your classes and in this program, it's been, what is the strategy of the company? how is this company actually creating value or not creating value, right? And that is so fundamentally different because like those core elements are there, but it goes so beyond that into strategy. And that's what I had really wanted out of the program was if I'm working on a project or I'm taking on a project or I'm trying to analyze something for a company, what can I compare this to that someone else has done? And how is this actually creating value? And that's so different. And you in particular, strategy was such a key piece to everything. If you brought in Netflix, DoorDash, Uber, whoever to look at for good or bad, it was, are they actually creating value, or is this an illusion of value, or and that's so different than just the traditional debit credit.
Right. Yeah, and that's what honestly makes the class so fun to teach because it's applied. We can bring in, I think we spend most of our time on like what's going on in the news, how do we have that conversation around it, and the strategy to me, like what's the specific value of accounting? I would say is it just gives us the ability to get granular, to look at things like particular cost structures, to debate fixed or variable, to make a forecast assumption by breaking revenue into segments. And everything is what I try to emphasize really in all my cases, and this is kind of like the answer key, I guess, in some ways, but it's like there's always more behind the scenes than just the superficial. And do we know everything? Of course not. But the goal is to use it as a lens in the peer into, as you say, the strategy, what's happening, and how do we make sure if we're making an argument, and that could be an argument for something and against it simultaneously, which today in our presentations of the last day of class, we did. And it was really awesome to see the short thesis, the long thesis. And I think the best takeaway wasn't, which one was right or there's one single answer to valuation, but the perspectives we got from at least, putting ourselves in the shoes of each side and thinking about, what factors would influence this company be overvalued, undervalued, or just really what factors should we be aware of before we make any decision around that. So it's a fun class to teach. I absolutely loved having you as a student because of all the insights you offered across the years. But with that, let's jump into this. So Netflix. We're assuming everybody, as I said up front, you're familiar with Netflix. That's kind of why we're doing it. And full disclosure again, in class, I will try to find companies that, one, students are comfortable with, two, are in the news, but three, and I think this is what makes it fun for me, there's something below the surface. So it's not just, this thing that looks good is awesome, or this thing that looks bad is terrible. Like there almost always is nuance, but importantly, it's like data behind the nuance. How did we use information to get into that? And that's effectively what we try to do in class.
Yeah.
So if you're ready, let's jump into that with Netflix.
Sure.
And I don't think there's any need to kind of tell everybody who Netflix is, but what's the massive issue in front of us is the last couple months have been fundamentally different. Whether you look at the stock price at its highs, we're right around $700, down to right around, actually, I'm not looking at it today, but right around $200, let's say. That's a big sell-off, right? We had two kind of big events over the release of the 2021 financials and then Q1 of 2022. We've got a lot going on. Seems like it's overall a negative reaction. This is not designed to be a stock recommendation in any ways, but more of a what are some things to think about. So Chris, I want to kind of throw this back at you for a second, which is, so other than this big decline in the stock price and lots of news, like just so we're all on the same page here, what's the big thing going on with Netflix?
Yeah, they've been this magical company that's been growing nonstop, growing subscribers nonstop for the last however many years, 10 years, if not more. And this is their first quarter where the actual number of subscribers has dropped a bit. And the market has reacted in a bit of a panic sense.
Right.
But that whole industry has really and we can talk about that more in a bit, it's changed so much since Netflix got into streaming. Everyone's getting into streaming now. All the big media players, and a lot of them have gotten even bigger over time. So, but it's that subscriber drop that's really causing a lot of it.
Yeah, and I don't want to be nitpicky with Chris, but I do this all the time in class. It's the subscribers drop, but then you could argue that roughly 700,000 of those were from Russia, what happened there. But there is still this fact that they have to deal with going forward, which is there's a plateauing of their growth. So whether we argue it's a slight decrease, a slight increase, or somewhere, it is a fundamental difference where the user growth is effectively hitting a plateau. And as you mentioned, that's new. But I think it's worth noting a little bit of the past. Not that history repeats, but just to be aware of it. And so the fun question to ask is, has Netflix been faced, and Chris, we'll both kind of chime in here, but has Netflix faced a situation where it looked like everyone was criticizing them and they needed or were considering or were embarking on some, I don't want to call this like a paradigm shift. So there's many, let's go through them.
Yeah,
Why don't you go through from the beginning?
The earliest one to me is when they were a DVD. You You got mail home DVDs. That was their business. And when Reed Hastings was like, no, we're going to start streaming, they were called so foolish. So this is never going to work, blah, blah, blah. It worked out so well for them. And so that,
in the long run.
In the long run, yeah. But at that moment in time, I think they were kind of looking at themselves and going, hey, this isn't going to be sustainable in the future. How do we change? Well, you know, at that time you had on-demand TV and other things were happening, right? And they kind of looked ahead and were like, streaming. Yeah. And then later on, it was with making their own content. Yeah. And that sustained them for a little while longer. Right. They kind of beat a lot of that to the punch. But now it's this next step where it's like, okay, what is that next thing they're going to do? Yeah. Because those were the two big ones in my head.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think the fascinating thing is they were criticized for it. Quickster, I think, is like a dirty word to say, right? When you're talking about Netflix, like this was an abysmal failure. At least initially, that's the way it appeared. But certainly, that was just forward thinking of not what are we doing well, not resting on our laurels, not, hey, congratulate us for being the leader in DVDs, but it's more of a, look, the world will change. Exactly when? We don't know, certainly, and maybe they had a better understanding of it. We certainly didn't know. But how do we change in anticipation of this, this secular trend or this, this unavoidable reality? The second one, again, just to reiterate your point, Chris, is going into content streaming. I mean, we cover an article in class we kind of have a debate around, which is a heavy criticism of them of going in to kind of start off their own content creation.
The quote was that they were burning cash on creating all this IP, creating all this content. In reality, if you look at industry as a whole, right? Disney in the last 10, 15 years, first acquisition was Pixar in 2006, $7 billion. Then Marvel in 2008, $4 billion. 2012 Lucasfilm, another $4 billion. And then most recently, 20th Century Fox, $79 billion. On the other side, Comcast, they tried to hostily take over Disney in 2004. Yeah. When that didn't work out, they bought NBC Universal instead. So there are people that see the value of content and you need it. Comcast is a cable company. As people cut cable, they were like, well, they're still going to be paying for internet. If we own the content, we kind of own our own destiny.
Right.
And that was for Netflix. Yeah. As Universal and Disney and Warner Brothers pull their content off of our platform,
right,
we need to have our own.
Yeah. Yeah, and we discussed that one. So that was like the classic case we've covered in financial statement analysis on Netflix was, a few years ago, looking back, like why did they go in their own content? And Chris nailed it. I just want to emphasize that one more time, which is that if you are just a third-party streaming company, you have no sustainable competitive advantage. Because I want to be clear, in the long run, obviously that could work for years, and it did work, right? But their success was realizing that, look, in some long run, which nobody exactly can define, but in the long run, right, that can't be a sustainable competitive advantage because anyone else can do it. So what did they do? They pushed hard. What did that mean? You use the word burning cash, right? That's the pejorative or negative way of looking at it, but like the reality is, as you pointed out with all those comparables, like that's the necessary thing to be in this broadly defined entertainment area.
They were investing in their future and really in this space, investing in their own intellectual property.
Yeah.
Stranger Things, a series that they own the content for. They can now license out for t-shirts. You know what I mean? It's so much bigger than just like content on their platform. Yeah. We own this IP. They can have all these different branch points and prequels because that's how that whole world works.
Good. Let's fast forward to today, though, right? Yeah. They're in that thing. We know them. We can all kind of think about the shows that Netflix has created and done well. But the big thing now is, do we have some degree of like streaming fatigue? What's one consideration? And then on top of that, hey, is this a situation, and we asked this question in class, but is that where the first mover advantage, the company that goes out and does it, it's actually a disadvantage because what they've effectively done is done like product and research and marketing development, product development, marketing and research to basically just lower the barriers to entry for others. Now, I don't mean others like anybody can do it, but for the other behemoths who are there in adjacent industries to come in and grab it. And so I want to ask this rhetorically, and we'll debate it a little bit more, but like, is this situation now that we're seeing in 2022 the manifestation of a company whose past success you can't knock, but whose future might be bleak because effectively what they've done through their own success, their own business model, is show that, hey, others,
this works.
You could do this too. And again, those others are, back to Chris's point, the Disney, the Comcast, et cetera, others who have a lot to lose if they don't react. So they're definitely going to react. So that's rhetorical. We'll debate that a little bit more. But I guess I want to throw this question at you. You can add anything there if you want. Yeah. But is there anything different? Like, what's different? Is it simply there's got to be more to it than there always is, than just, hey, first mover advantage, but if first mover advantage becomes a disadvantage when you basically show everybody else how to do it. So what else, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's going to be challenging for them. Looking at that industry as a whole, Amazon is in this space, right? I wouldn't say they're necessarily like terrific at it with their Prime Video, they are making their own content. They just bought MGM. Why? It wasn't even like, one, it was MGM's back library of all their stuff from the 40s, 50s, 60s, but the James Bond franchise alone. They're going to make TV series of it. They're going to make a whole movie. So it's, I think Netflix was a little bit far enough ahead of the game with creating their own content, but it's hard when all these bigger players have other branches. Disney and Comcast is an example. They also, like Comcast owns the Philadelphia Flyers, owns the Universal Studios theme parks. There's other channels to help bolster everything. And for Netflix, it's just, right now, it's just their platform. A lot of other studios that have other things than just the studio itself. Right. And I even worry about, well, if Apple gets, right, they have Apple TV Plus. What if at some point they go, hey, Disney stock is really low, I want to buy that. Or they could even buy Netflix, as to help just bolster their content.
Yeah, I want to leave off the acquisition potential and still kind of stick with Netflix. But Chris mentioned something, which is that the intensity of the competition has fundamentally changed, but so have the actions of those competitors and the demographics or the particular factors that they're going to bring to the table. So we had this conversation on our walk over here, but what else can they do? And one of the things I want to kind of set up is what's the pushback on this first mover advantage becoming a disadvantage? And a thought is, are there still, user growth has plateaued, but I think it's worth discussing, at least entertaining the idea of opportunities for monetization without, let's hold this as a given, which, just to take that position. User growth is going to plateau. The people who are on watching Netflix are going to be the people who keep watching Netflix or who watch Netflix, but they're going to struggle to gain new people to come into Netflix who've never used it before. So that's the plateauing of user growth. But there's a different question here, which we're going to bring back to revenue, and I'm going to also refer to as monetization. What are the ways they can continue to monetize with what they have without actually seeing user growth? And we had this conversation, but I think it's just worth fleshing this out. So opportunities, angles for monetization without, or given, let me restate that a little bit, given the constraint to user growth. Well, what do we have here, Chris? What do you think?
One of the low-hanging fruits that they talked about on their earnings call was advertising, right? Hulu already does it. They subsidize a lot of their subscriptions with, you can get a $4.99 subscription or $2.99 subscription by viewing ads. And that would be a new revenue stream for Netflix. Could maybe reduce a barrier to entry for anybody that balked at $9.99 or that was sharing, because that's another issue that they've got of people sharing accounts. So if now all of a sudden, no, it's cheap enough that I can get my own account. Right. That's another thing that they can kind of do there. Yeah, so let me flesh out that point a little bit, Chris. I think it's great. They also announced that there's 100 million, or roughly 100 million, I think that's a rounded number, users who are watching, users of Netflix, let me make sure I state this correctly, but are unpaid in some way. That's sharing of some degree, whether it's within a family or across friends, whatever else. I don't have that granular data, but I think they do. Nevertheless, that's a group who, and this is just a conversation worth entertaining, they almost surely have had to have, some of those people have to be price sensitive, as in, look, I can't and I won't pay the full amount, but I think it's worth acknowledging that, is there some percent of that 100 million or roughly 100 million who, it's not I won't pay anything or I'll pay something, but I just can't pay the full amount. And I think that's exactly I don't think it was coincidental that the advertising is kind of, the conversation is beginning right along this time, and Netflix may have had this conversation for years before that. But what are you getting there? You have a way of it has to be a lower price point, right? The easy criticism, Netflix doesn't have advertising, so if they introduce it, it's going to piss people off. Well, no, they can, I want to be clear, I don't have market research, I'm not a marketer, but there's a way that they can use their data, they can use their marketing expertise, they can do that, kind of run all those numbers to figure out, okay, how do we price this so that we have a top tier level of a subscriber, and we have a far lower level of a subscriber, and the goal is for some of those individuals who are not, who were not paying, or maybe you just weren't even in the Netflix stream, are willing to come in at some significantly, I'm going to throw numbers out here, but I'm making them up, $3, $4, $5. So any thoughts on the pricing of that, or what kind of pressures they need to consider, or who else they need to be aware of? If you have 100, it's sort of a good problem. If you have 100,000,
I agree with that.
You know what I mean?
It's a problem, it's a challenge, but it might be a good one. Yeah, keep going, I like that point.
If I have 100,000 users that are not subscribers, it at least is telling me my content, my video content is interesting enough that you are viewing it. You're just not paying me for it. So is it that the $9.99 or $11.99 price point that they're at right now is too high? And do they need to, because I do fear, it would be a survey and looking at their own data, does add screw with the Netflix mojo to the point, and it's like, well, what if subscription prices drop to $4.99 and you're limited to one screen? Like, would that help? There's a couple different levers that they can pull. And it's not one thing in isolation, but at least like there's a hint of promise in the sense that you've got 100,000 people viewing your content that aren't paying you for it. It's at least showing you they wouldn't watch it if it wasn't interesting, right? There's so much competition for eyeball time. And like that says a lot.
And I think the mistake would be, and we have this conversation in class all the time, the mistake is to at least not acknowledge a different perspective, and without knowing which one's right. But I think the mistake is to assume that the 100 million, the value of them to Netflix is zero, and that there's no amount that would bring them in, or at least some of them. I would be willing to bet there are some in that 100 million who the value is zero. They're only using it because it's completely free to them, there's no cost, and if it was a penny, they wouldn't work out. But that cannot be all of them. So then, like, what price point? Again, we have to admit complete ignorance to what they should charge, but there has to be something less than, I guess we know the ceiling, right? The current price we have, they're not paying for a reason. That current price is probably too high, but could it be the advertising thing? Could it come in a lot lower? So I love the way you say that. I think it works well. It's a problem. It's a massive challenge, but it might be a good problem because in light of the fact that they have that plateauing of users, there is still this monetization opportunity. They must navigate it carefully, but they've navigated crises or challenges before, so maybe they can pull it off. It is no easy solution. It might be a massively bumpy ride. It's certainly gonna be different than the ride they've taken, during COVID when things were amazing for them. But like, there's a chance there.
I talked about how the big media companies being so massive could be a challenge for Netflix. I think Netflix still having the feeling of a startup could help them here, because that's what got them to streaming. You know what I mean? That's what got them to start creating their original content early on. So in this case here, them being a little more innovative and nimble, I think could play to their advantage.
And I want to kind of give the shout out to I think it's the Land of the Giants podcast that covered Netflix, but one of the themes that comes out of that is this idea that like it's a culture that's not without its flaws, and people have criticized a variety of things. I would be willing to bet of any large institution, and not even specific to companies there, but that this like a relentless like startup kind of culture around like don't rest on your laurels, push forward, and so that's at least gives you a fighting chance when you come across some major paradigm shift or challenge. So I actually want to bring class in here for a second for this reason. We were talking on our walk over here. We were kind of prepping for this, which was definitely another fun conversation that Chris and I have had. We usually chat outside right after class and have had those many times. And we just finished our last class today. But I think it's worth acknowledging why they must think about this monetization. And there's a couple features I want to kind of bring in. The financial data from the recent quarterly first quarter of 2022, which is that their expenses have grown. And when you read the 10Q, the reason they're given is that they've basically increased personnel. And I think it's sales and marketing and general administrative. It might be one other, but generally speaking, the point is made more than once that the increase in the expense, not only as a dollar amount, but also as a percent of sales relative to the prior seasonally adjusted quarter, is a decision to increase personnel. And so what does that imply, at least we should be thinking about, is that they need to grow. They're planning for growth, and then they need to grow, because if they're not able to monetize in some way and grow revenue, those expenses will increase. The content stuff that you were talking about, like everybody's not taking their foot off the gas on this content stuff. You're gonna have to push more into that. So there's like the cash flows that are spent up front, and then there's the amortization of that over time. So whether you take an expense perspective or a cash flow perspective, they're free cash flow positive right now, but that is not something that they can be like, oh, we always will be, because content is expensive, as Chris walked us through earlier, and everybody's spending on it. And so I just want to emphasize this piece on expenses, which is that, I guess, on expenses and content acquisition, they have committed to continue to do this. And given that, I just want to emphasize back to this, it's a problem, but it might be a good problem. That's the push towards, hey, they need to figure out ways to monetize. But, that's just my I guess I want to weave that back into class for that reason of like, just the general idea that like, it's worth getting that, and we do this a lot in class, like it's worth getting the granular data, not because that tells us everything, but just to be able to make sure that like, hey, like, what is Netflix doing? And one interpretation of Q1 is, the subscriber growth thing. But another one is, increasing personnel. They haven't taken their foot off the gas, as the analogy I used before, with respect to content. So guess who is still preparing for Netflix to continue to grow?
Netflix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they have to. How do they do that? When do they do that? We don't know, right? We obviously don't work there and don't have any unique insight, but I just want to emphasize that like the subscriber growth is a problem. I think there are outs or opportunities for them, potential, ways of navigating that with advertising, with converting non-paying to paying. But I also want to acknowledge it's a challenge and the pressure's on because if their expenses continue to rise, and they see margin compression otherwise, if they're pushing the content acquisition, which again is kind of a free cash flow reduction because they're going to spend the cash up front, amortize it later, but amortization is a huge expense for them now because that stuff moves quickly or gets outdated relatively quickly. There is absolutely pressure on Netflix to figure out how are they going to navigate this. I think it's fair to say, not that they can't do it, but there will be a fundamentally different challenge going forward than there was behind them.
Yeah, I brought it up earlier at the start of the conversation. That whole media industry, Netflix has gone from being a platform to being a media company, because of their own content. And just that whole industry has collapsed on itself so much. The big tech companies have gotten involved and have bought studios. I think Netflix has essentially evolved into a studio. And the personnel support, I would not be surprised if some of that is like for strategic partnership purposes. Like I know when I was living in Orlando, Universal had signed a contract to bring Stranger Things into their Halloween event. And that was a really big deal. And it's the first time Netflix owns something like that, that has that kind of opportunity.
Good. Well, I don't know. I think we could wrap it up, and I just want to maybe have a quick conversation to send us off here.
Yeah.
But let's just be, full disclosure. I've used that phrase a couple times now, but I'm an accountant and I like reading footnotes, so that's kind of the, flesh out all that information, gather as much as you can. This is we are trying to think about this. Hey, just have a marketing material for our MSF program, and if you're watching this and thinking about it, yes, we absolutely want to encourage you. And one thing I want to mention is that, I hope that we can do this, but Chris, this is definitely more of your perspective than mine, but if you're considering a business degree of any type, whether it's undergrad, whether it's a Master of Science in Finance or an MBA, et cetera, I think the starting point to that is conversations, right? Think about the businesses you interact with and try to figure out what is their strategy, what's the data to back that up. Have a conversation with friends, with colleagues, whatever it is, family members, and have that conversation. I just want to acknowledge again, I think Chris is just a great example and a pleasure to teach because every time we had we did something in class, there was almost immediate let me grab you for a moment in the hallway, and another 15 or 20 minutes, or sometimes 45 minutes later, we're still trying to flesh out something else, or how does this relate to what happened at Disney in this example, whatever else. So that's been great. And so Chris, that's my perspective. And again, I'm massively biased. I want to mention that one more time. But what are your thoughts on, I guess, back to the MSF program here for a moment. I truly appreciate you having this conversation with me, but any other thoughts on your journey, kind of once you walk through the doors and kind of what this year's been like, as you're just a few weeks away from graduation, and as you were telling me before this, you've got another final or whatever, and then you're basically done.
I'm done.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different thoughts. One, fastest year of my life, but what a good investment of time. You know what I mean? Of time and money resources, in the sense of I've learned so much. And just to talk about class stuff, some of the smartest professors I've ever encountered throughout my entire, I did undergrad 4 years, MBA 2.5 years, and now this. Same with students, the student body. I can say here in that MSF class was the smartest group of people I've ever been around. They're really, really good. The conversation stuff, what we're having right now, this is normal for anyone that is looking at that. In your class is 100% normal. I would say for most of the professors, if you want to engage further and have a deeper conversation or ask a question about, hey, I saw this in the news. I think for Dr. Wiles, I asked him about the Starbucks, Howard Schultz coming back to Starbucks. And we had a 20-minute conversation about what his take was on why he's back. Yeah. And I love that, So it's been incredible. And I think the exit opportunities too, the job that I'm going into, it's because of the Longhorn Network and everything too. Right. But I was looking for a deep dive to make.
Let me just interject there. Not the Longhorn Network, the media conglomerate.
No.
Just with all your media content. Now, anyway, just to bring that all together. Keep going. Sorry to cut you off.
The alumni base here, which is incredible.
He's not going into production or media stuff.
No.
Anyway, go ahead.
No. But where was it going with this?
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Just overall, it's been such a good experience, and my goal was to get better at finance. I was good at it. Like I had it in the MBA. I loved that class. But it wasn't the area that I had broadened my focus in. And this was an opportunity to take like 30 finance credits in a year. Yeah. And I now can say like, yeah, I'm a master of, I need the work experience too to bolster that further. But I think I have enough tools that if someone threw something at me, I can analyze it and figure it out, which is what I wanted. And your class, I think so much of it was, I don't want to use the word forensic, but it almost was in the sense of like, you laid it out for us and like we would have to go in and go, how is this company actually making money? Or what is it that they're spending here? It never once was, and this goes in this bucket because it's an account receivable. Yeah. No, it was so much more than that. And it's a strategy piece. I'm going to use that everywhere I go. Yeah. Like long term for me, it's consulting. And then I would love to go back and hopefully run one of these media companies or tech companies one day. Right. And what I learned here, I think is going to be that last piece to help me go do it, which is great. Good.
Yeah, and I think that's just really important, which is like, how do we make sure that we obviously have great students coming in? You know, we give our best. I mean, I find encouragement in like getting that back and forth, and I love those conversations. But to make sure that we're doing all we can to create that value. So, Chris, with that, I think we can wrap things up. I just wanted to thank you again for the whole year. It's been fun.
Yeah.
And hopefully you enjoyed that. Again, if you have any, reach out to our recruitment staff and admissions side of the Master of Science in Finance. But I just want to echo this again. To me, this is what business is. And so the financial statement analysis class is the one that I teach. I was chatting with one of my MBAs yesterday, actually, and the comment was like, should we rename it? My thought is like, it's analyzing businesses using their financial information. And the financial information is just the background piece, and it still is, how do you try to at least have that conversation around businesses? And yeah, crazy, back to your point, like those are discussions. So have those, engage in those, come, join us, hook them at UT. And we think it's a great experience. Chris, I wanted to thank you again. I really appreciate the time today. But that's great, and hopefully this was useful and informative conversation, and hopefully we can do more of them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, thank you, Dr. B.